The Rainbow Circle Throne Room of Jah Rastafari. A summary report on the Nyabingi missions to the eastern United States, 1988 to 1991. Written, compiled and submitted by Dr. Jakes Horniak, Director. National Anthropological Archives. National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution, Washington, D.C. November 2, 1995. February L, 1996. To Supreme Council, House of Nyabingi. Scots Pa Nyabingi Kana. Scots Past Postal Agency. Manchester, Jamaica. From Jakes Horniak. Director, National Anthropological Archives. National Museum of Natural History. Smithsonian Institution. Washington, D.C. 20560. Trods of the Nyabingi Elders to Eastern United States under the banner of the Rainbow Circle Throne Room of Jah Rastafari. Rastafari greetings. One Ola love in house. Give thanks and praise unto the name of the living I, His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. Give judgment unto the King and righteousness unto his sons' daughters, annually. L. Statement of Purpose. For some years now, it has been intention to provide the House, in general, the Assembly of Elders, which is now designated as the Supreme Council of Elders, with a formal report on the missions which traveled to the eastern U.S. in 1988, 1989, 1990. I offer this report as a humble remnant who has been privileged to have grounded with elders since the Golden Jubilee year of 1980 and who Jah saw fit to assist House in mounting its first official trod to the United States in 1988. This statement to the House is based on several concerns. I list them serially. Firstly, there is the issue of documenting the historical initiatives taken by the House in recent years and making this information to as NNY brethren sistren as possible. The need for such documentation derives from the accelerated pace with which the House has become a force in the internationalization of Rastafari. The principle of collective security notwithstanding, individuals within the House have little in the way of a formal record of their own history-making events. It is fair to say that Ras Ivy has emerged as the chronicler within the House of these international events. See, for example, his excellent pamphlet entitled The Centenary Trod to Ethiopia, 1992. The same, these warrant greater coverage. I accordingly non-commercial report as part of my own documentation of recent historical events which can be shared within the House the ranks of Rastafari more generally. Secondly, those of us privileged enough to have been involved with the ambassadorial initiatives of movement have an obligation to make the House aware of a range of cultural resources that have been generated in the course of these international trods. My own view is that information on these trods, as well as information about their impact on Rasta communities abroad, are unevenly shared with members of the House. As for the resources which they have, I am speaking specifically about videotape documentation that was produced in with 1988 and 1989 trods as well as documentation created in relation to events in 1990 and 1991. Some of these materials are currently archived in the Human Studies Film of the Smithsonian Institution. Some 1989-1 have periodically made parts or all of this record available to Rastafari Brethren MD Sistren upon request. Prior to Centenary Trod, for example, I was visited by Ras San Brown and Sister Destar who requested copies of all tip videotapes shot in association with the 1988 mission. I subsequently made this, as well as other materials, available to Sister I. Similarly, I have also given videotape copies of His Imperial Majesty's Silver Jubilee ceremony filmed in Addis Ababa, 1955, to Rastafari who have requested it. I also wish to note during the 1988 Trod, the film Elements of Rastafari Voices, a film produced by Elliot Leib Arul Rene Romano, were turned over to the delegation in Washington, D.C. This was done at the initiative of Elliot Leib in consultation with delegation which traveled to Los Angeles, see Appendix I. The elements to Rastafari Voices have been the official property of the House since August 1988. The House can, if so desired, use this film educational or fundraising purposes. Film elements were placed into the hands of Dr. Val Carnegie, Director of the African Caribbean of Jamaica in 1989. They are still, to my knowledge, at the Institute. I should point out that the elements themselves be projected but would have to be copied at a film lab in order to produce a print distribution. In any event, I doubt that many brethren and sistren are even aware of the fact that the film and any commercial rights in it belong to House. It is my view that these kinds of materials are part of the cultural heritage of I and should be made accessible to any and all Rastafari request them. Again, my overall impression is that brethren and sistren are aware of these resources, nor have they reasoned collectively with respect to the position which the House should take with respect to them. Details concerning the scope of these resources are beyond what I can communicate in this report. I am prepared, however, to reason about any of these issues with the Supreme Council. Thirdly, I believe that the information contained in report as well as familiarity with the videotape nzteria.ls about which I speaking may prove useful, both the edification they provide and as a vehicle for revolutionary self-criticism. In my specific case, this documentation will serve to set the record straight on several counts, especially as concerns the Smithsonian's supposed involvement and contribution to the Trods as well as my own works in this regard. The House, of course, has traditionally been very cautious in its dealings with outsiders, and rightfully so. I say this in full awareness that many labels have been applied to in course of my Rasta movements. These vary from brethren, to sympathizer to pirate to CIA spy. For this reason, I have always conducted my affairs in full public view of the House and remain open to reasoning. It is most always the case that my moves to Jamaica are timed to coincide with Bingi celebrations in order to nuke myself accessible to House. I regard myself as privileged to move within the inner circles of Rastafari. Not everything that is good to eat is good to speak. This communication is made in the same spirit as well as in accordance with the principle of collective security which always guided I movements. Let now turn to some of my own reflections on changes which I have witnessed over the past 15 years as well as broader transformations which I have gleaned from reasoning with the elders. These comments provide a wider context for the documentation assembled in this report. 2. Movements of Jah people. From stage to stage and strength to strength. Rastafari is a reality has developed from stage to stage. Today, one often hears the elders remark that this is a different movement than in the days of Backo Wall, Trench Town, or Waracre Hill. In 1980, the year of the Golden Jubilee, when I first began to trod the irates of the Bingi, there was still a handful of within the House who could attest to having heard Marcus Garvey preach Dog Park on Regent Street or in Kingston's Liberty Hall. Some had made regular visits to Pinnacle to participate in Leonard Howell's Ethiopian Salvation Society services. A larger cohort of elders bear the living testimony of having carried the movement through the camp and yard period in Kingston. This period, when culture vast just developing up T, marks the hottest battle fought by Jah soldiers. The dread sites in which brethren and sistren sustained one another, places like the Dungle, Backo Wall, Aki Walk, Foreshore Road, Waracre Hills, Waterhouse, and Moonlight City are now part of a legendary cultural geography. After the historic visit of the King 1966, and after the Jamaican government destroyed the Rasta areas of Backo Wall, Aki WA.LK, Road the mid-1960s, the House beyond sponsorship of all island assemblies held in sites Steertown, Robbins Bay, 9 Miles Beach, Freeman's Hall, Lucky Valley, Willowfield, Sunny Hill, Guys Hill, Freetown, Round Hill, Portland Cottage, and Angelets. For decades, these are real other sites of all island assembly have served to link the congregation in unity. A new plateau was reached in the early 1980s through a series of international Rastafari assemblies held both and outside Jamaica. Reggae, of course, played an important role in the initial spread of message internationally. For the roots, however, it was the advent of the international Rastafari assemblies in early 1980s that would carry things to a next stage. As missions sponsored by the House have traveled abroad, there has been a corresponding process by which Rastafari from foreign make their own pilgrimages to Jamaica to ground with elders and ground with the House. Since the first International Convention 1982, Toronto, the Nyabingi House has accordingly become more and more an international community which embraces Rastafari from Toronto, Canada to Rocky Point, from Atlanta, Georgia to Hector's River, and from Washington, D.C. to Scotts Pass. In this process of internationalization, the elders of the Divine Order of the Nyabingi have assumed their rightful role as instruments of cultural upliftment and spiritual inspiration. However, it is also to say the House is still in its infancy with respect to these new ambassadorial initiatives. Despite the principle of collective security, the House still lacks a means of bringing all its members equally into process. The principle of each one teach one, for example, applies at a more complex level, not merely to elders their charges in yard. In governmental context of the House, it applies mutually to the elders in Jamaica and to brethren and sistren outside Jamaica. Many of our community activists, organizers, upon the elders rely for support in practical administrative matters. This is the more complex kind of unity which requires the effective sharing of information. However, it is also true that some Mon push out DEM head more than others, while the same time influentialists within the House seek to control the composition or real agendas of given missions abroad. The existing organization of the House, and the limits on information flow to all members, is another reason why I have chosen to place this report with several of the elective records. 3. Documenting the history, the internationalization of the House. The Elders' mission to the United States, which arrived late April of 1988, returned in August that year, was not the first international trod. In 1982 the House had a mission to Eastern Caribbean led by Ras Bonerges, Pa Ashanti, Bongo Tini. In 1984 the first mission outside the Caribbean was led by Ras Bonerges, travelled to Toronto under the banner of Sons of Thunder. In 1986 a delegation Ras Bonerges Aril Ras travelled to London to In Rastafari Focus, a program which was held as part of a wider series of cultural events as Caribbean Focus. All of these were path-breaking events which conferred a higher profile upon the House, the movement in general. Prelude to the Rainbow Circle Trods. The events above all occurred prior to the first mission to the United States in 1988, known as the Rainbow Circle Throne Room. I should point out here that the House actually sent 2 delegations abroad as part of this mission, one to the West Coast, Los Angeles, one to the East Coast, New York, D.C., Balfour. All of Trods noted above sought to raise positive profile of the movement in other nations. While the 1988 mission to the US had this goal, it is also necessary to that it was also precipitated by the widespread crisis atmosphere which existed Jamaican Rastafari communities in the metropolitan United States. The context for this atmosphere was established early 1980s can be traced to the installation of conservative governments in both US and Jamaica, with the Reagan and Seeger regimes, respectively. In the case of the Reagan administration, this atmosphere featured a general paranoia about immigration from Caribbean and Latin America, increasing racial tension within U.S. society, and a targeting of ethnic groups for what was seen as an attack on the moral values of white Anglo-Saxon America. Drugs and those disseminated them were seen as part of this scourge. By the mid-1980s, mindset devoted considerable attention to Jamaicans and Colombians. In 1985, this led the United States Drug Enforcement Administration to revive a program named Operation Buccaneer in Jamaica under the Seeger administration. The program earmarked $9 million destruction the ganja crop, mostly that sowed by small planters attempting to supplement their helicopter sorties 5 days a week. According to the DEA, ganja formed a central part of the political economy of Jamaica and they were bent on its eradication. The North American trade in ganja was also publicized in relation to the grown of Jamaican posses in metropoles of U.S., even though the latter, when apprehended, were more frequently indicted on cocaine charges. Associations widely publicized in press and media formed the public context in which Jamaicans and even more critically Rastafarians found themselves viewed. Jamaican posses, the criminalization of Rasta, and the D.C. community. During much 1980s, Rasta communities in the US found themselves under siege in large measure due to the media coverage, public hysteria being generated over the criminal activities of urban drug gangs known as Jamaican posses. It was invariably case that Rastafari were misrepresented and criminalized by the print and television media through coverage associated with these gangs. See Appendix 2. Newspaper on posses appeared in nearly all of the major metropolitan papers of the U.S., example, Philadelphia Inquirer, Washington Post, New York Times. Invariably, these articles implied a connection between posses and Rasta. In one instance of television news coverage, a network, I believe it was CBS, sent a reporter to Kingston to do some background documentation. The reporter delivered his segment by positioning himself in front of a local reggae music shop. Flanked on one side by a portrait of Bob Marley and on the other by a painting of Haile Selassie, he delivered his report on posses without ever mentioning Rastafari. The pictures behind him, however, implicitly linked Rasta to criminality, the public mind. In addition, Rastafari, i.e. Jamaican-speaking dreadlocks, were increasing cast as urban terrorists in various popular television series such as Miami Vice, Wise Guy, L.A. Law, and Mike Hammer. On one of the early Miami Vice episodes, the star, Crockett, Don Johnson, was explaining to his partner Tubbs how his first partner died. The dialogue goes: Crockett, yeah, we were gaming, investigating, some Rastas. Tubbs, what happened? Crockett, well, we were gaming these Rastas and the leader put 2 bullets in my partner's face. A Wise Guy episode of same period opens Wu.Hacan era over TKES, Emma to 3 dreadlocks on a rooftop, with Remchine guns, apparently waiting to ambush Sun E01 confrig down street. As the hero calls Dowry TLE Street in his car, MD gets out, TKE dreads open fire. Most off-plot unfee, LDS around the hero trying to escape from these thugs. All of TKE's media flows had a powerful influence on stereotyping Rastas as violent urban criminals. This was a kind of misrepresentation, a real irresponsibility which the DC Rasta community was attempting to counteract with the FRST delegation in 1988. See Operation Caribbean Cruise and Coalition Caribbean Cruise. In early dawn hours of February 6, 1986, the Jarnakan Rastamri C. On Munity of Washington, D.C. was literally by the largest police raid of the District of Columbia. 5 Hereford, 500, Metropolitan Police stormed the community on that evening expecting to arrest a number of Rastamri Rai were hiding HRG caches of drugs weapons. Tirade proved essentially fruitless and located no signal from drug traffic, particularly Arnong local Rastamri. Tai assigned with the police action did, however, seek to criminalize BCAL Rastamri. A copy of Ter DC Police Armnua.L used to prepare officers FRTLE operation was quoted as describing Rastamri as of a religium core, ove mood for the avi mid plus or minus G in order to the Ilat Muthma oft proent, Sega, JMT et, Lur. A Caribbean community p. 1, 386, and as cultists who FMO the LSCSMD co *D Wue to use than, Walkton Post, p. 18, 20386, see Appendix ill, and of TKE local DC conformity resulted in righteous outrage led to the mention of a Grassroots Coalition KMWN as co-percent N against Operation Koean Cruise. It was led by Adair Tompkins, a Rastamri Sistran, a real Rasped and a community activist raised in Nglarks, L to T. EUSW, Re-Atterilled Howard University T. ERNW 1970s, see Apex Illinois. Members of T.KEBCAL Rastafari assumed to protect TL, themselves by countering TKE Jonatu Badgun Totting Ernage Press had constructed of Rasta%.ri. Efforts to educate TLE press based on so-called Soxalbite coverage oft-lay accusal cone MT possibly be clinud of racial polarization created by regional administration this time NNDETFFS task all T. RRMIE difficult. TKECOM, enmity T, Irefre resolved to assist a dictation of Nyabingi elders carry TLE tradition merward in order to educate Edidolo RTKE public at large while saying to strengthen BCAL brethren sisterin. After a prolonged period of plard.ning aid coordinian armies. Seri to cut through Babylonian red tape, Renushan, consisting of over 15 Eklas, including 2 Ikia sisterin, arrived at Joel F. Ka1 Efedi International Airport on May 23, 1988. Arong Otters, TK Renushan Ras Sarnial Livux, Re Brown, Bongo Tilly, Bongo Tawny, Bongo Bigger, Bongo Sif and Fraser, Bongo Piddo Golding, Raz Ivy Wright, Raz Ibo Rigm, Fry Irons, Bongo Joe, Iyavi, Sister But Percent Les, Sister Ina, Sister Esmelin, Raz Maurice Clark. Mutabaruka accompanied Dewayan to several venues eluding T1 era Pirawi at Howard University. 4. The Washington, D.C. and Rasta community and the Smithsonian's involvement. A. The TMD. Few NPMBERs oft, a house are aware oft, et na rings the C1s that were necessary to make the FRST for the reality. I outlive saw oft, East Beb Hubbly. TKE Procliared desire Mr. Renushan of elders from Jamaica was voiced by DC Rastas following TLR Caribbean cruise debacle early 1986. It would be another 2 years before TKE roadblocks of bureaucratic KNSLESL were overcome. TKE Yundwork between TKE House in Jamaica TLE local DC Cornman Y arranged. My involvement began about 2 RMNTHS after Chibian cruise ran. Ayes contacted on separate occasions to Rastafari, Sister Nzinga Aril Ras Simron Heron, had been put in touch with by Sister Farua Birhan. Sister Fa. Rua Ati I were aware of each other though Groxlings with house in TLR early 1980s. This led to my in a series of IT eating with Otler community leaders including R.A.S. Peddy and Raz Mikul McCullough. Tai DC Rasta Community El that Renushan by Repiembers Oftki House Wune Sut ZM to educate TLE public about TLE culture counter nunny oft one I ignite stereotypes about Rastamri. In course of my 11 eatings with TLE local leaders in Washington, D.C., it was agreed that I would intent to secure visas TLR Eklas through the Smithsonian Institution. As of United Government, we pre-sun, PD Smithsonian QH Isha I accessory visas are ill cut through T, Kutian Engisterial dismissiveness which IMST genuines, MT to Rastas, would around to TKE US Embassy. Ensre was, Idweather, Probcom. IFRN, NL or PO and NT. Ashanit. Sonian which would allow to Ohane visas. Allow to digress IR. In 1985 one received a postdoctoral in TKE Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology. This was based a dissertation I had written about Rastamri Eni Umsieng at of Days BHCK, Eldenhip and oral tradition in Rastamri Kultan as well as my contiming work with the Rumvenvent. In order to STQ-port my hernally, I accepted a position on the staff of the institution's Hun STU and S mm archives. This me to sponsor a decnion of elders, Sunet. Which even T. EDC sister in Hile to realize. I had, however, developed a number of contacts TLZ in Stitland which enabled to interest several of colleagues in taking a closer look Rastamri. OT of these, Nick Spitzer, was sympathetic to my Mr. delegation. He worked as a part-time DJ in Philadelphia in the early 1970s had interviewed Bob Marley T. E. Whalers on his PM-gram. Our inform NL immersed into be freft by persuading Otkers to support to the Kia if Lee Trod was to become a reality. I lobbed NY case for support through UT Emulsion. A SANA process was carried on Utul THS Smithsonian by Raz Abraham, Raz Mike McCullough, Sister FANA, Raz Simeon Hayon, who solicited letters of support from Community Organimu, NS and LRS. I also worked with TLR Jarmikan Empny MD with Jan Nikan Scholars of Fulse to secure letters of support for Delegnian Wuki and Avel. I Jilfamti, TLE Smith Mayan agreed to process paperwork visas. Thai institution would not, however, provide financial assist or Wi-Fi, are the mission. In this, DC Rasta community was on own. This RMD at IAssessor.ry to write a grant proposal to TLEDC Hunnities Corwil for at T. Asari time. This process also forwarded a ranging vents education.l and cultural presentations and requesting letters of report for TLE presamations. The proposal, included in this report, was written primarily by myself, Sister Farika, Raz Sir Leon Heron with input from other IT members of T.ke community. It defined the teat for an elders trod, outly one ed benefits which such a mission would bring to TTE community MD free public at large. MD identified a number of venues WFFCH had ready agreed to host presentations or programs by TKE delegation. See Appendix 4. Ultimately, this was in the armdest armung of $1,500. The communities most concerned with TROD, the New York, Washington, D.C. communities, found themselves very much in the position of feeding the multitudes from one small basket. These funds acquired from D.C. Humanities Council were a mere pittance, could not even begin to cover the travel expenses involved. The enthusiasm for the TROD among Rastafari in the D.C. New York communities, was enormous. I believe that they regarded this as a more monumental event than elders themselves. For the first time, many cited up Rasta outside the island of its birth would be coming face to face with the roots of their culture. Due to the generosity of New York DC community, funds were raised by individuals going into their pockets to cover the expenses of plane fares. Lodging was covered by brethren like Yahya in Baltimore. And meals were covered by the same generosity. Righteous Remnant or CIA Spy. During April of 1988 I spent 3 weeks in yard caucusing with members of the House who gathered from around the island. This involved me in extended sessions of reasoning with elders, both in separate yards in Kingston elsewhere in more formal meetings at 133 Tower Street, the law office of Brother Miguel Lawn, which was used as a meeting place to stage the TROD. I think it is fair to say that brethren and sistren within the House held highly divergent opinions my involvement in the TROD. And, no doubt, this range of opinions continues to exist with respect to my current movements. Many of those with whom I had grounded from 1980 onwards regarded me as a brethren and as a righteous remnant doing the work of Rastafari. Others clearly resented my presence, saw me as another academic opportunist, and regarded me as an unwanted interloper in Rasta business. Some of these were willing to plastic me to my face, use me for whatever they felt I could do, and discard me when convenient. Some clearly hoped that I would fall on my own sword. Others kept an open mind and were willing to judge me on the buys of my works. A few clearly felt that I was a CIA spy. One sistren actually started the rumor that I had a strategy to infect the delegation with the AIDS virus. One of the ranking elders in the House publicly declared his displeasure with Raz Abraham and the Washington, D.C. community for sending a white man to represent them, not only a white man but a bald tail to boot. In this regard, it should be noted that the original plans were for Raz Abraham to represent the D.C. community in these final face-to-face negotiations with the House. At the 11th hour, for whatever reasons, he was unable to make the trip and I volunteered my services. In the swirl of these divergent perceptions I became the focus for a number of public dramas played out for the benefit of the community. I saw these as responses to my alignment with certain elders within the House, to my academic and Smithsonian credentials, and as part of the customary testing that goes on among brethren and sistren. The idea that I was representing the Smithsonian, a quasi-agency within the U.S. government, and a citadel of Babylon, clearly served to increase deliberation within its ranks about the merits of the TROD. Some charged me with seeking to serve two masters, finalizing the delegation list, with a clean hands and a pure heart. One of the initial issues which had to be addressed in obtaining visas for the elders was to establish a list of who, in fact, would be on the delegation. In the course of attempting to establish this list I came to fully appreciate the principle of acting with a clean hands and a pure heart. This came, in part, from being unexpectedly thrust into the role of representing the Washington, D.C. community with the House in Jamaica and having to deal, in part, with the logistical issues raised by the TROD. This included addressing the issue of who was and who was not on the official list of elders that would constitute the delegation and in dealing with the timing of approaching the U.S. Embassy for the visas. Handling these issues gave me some insight into the inner workings of the house. There was, of course, no reason why I shouldn't have fulfilled these duties. After all, I was the individual who personally obtained the necessary paperwork to obtain the visas and had the necessary bureaucratic connections to make the process work. Neither Ras Abraham nor Miguel Lorne, or any of the elders controlled this part of the process. What neither of these individuals was able to provide me with was an official list of who the house had selected for the trod. Prior to departing for Jamaica in April, Ras Abraham was unable to provide me with such a list even though he reportedly had been in close contact with Brother Miguel Lorne, the brethren in Jamaican who had become the de facto chairman of the House's selection committee. There was, according to Ras Abraham's words, a lot of jostling taking place among the elders to be named on the list. While he assured me that he had been in touch with Brother Miguel about who was on the list, he was rather vague about what, if any, selection criteria were being used to produce that list. He simply stated to me that if you scienti dance in yard, you scienti dance abroad. This was, at best, a rather vague reference to being recognized as having ritual abilities within the house. When I arrived in yard and met with the house, no official list was forthcoming. After the first formal meeting at 133 Tower Street, Brother Miguel's law offices, it became clear that such a list would never be formulated. A few ranking elders like Ras Bonerges and possibly Ras Sam Brown had probably been nominated and ratified by consensus of the House. Others, however, had just as clearly put their own names forward hoping they would withstand scrutiny by the House. And still others were probably been nominated by one or more of the factions that exist within the House. Whatever the case, nothing was settled by the time I arrived and began to attend meetings with the House. One thing was clear from my own point of view: I was there on a mission. My duty was to ensure that a list was drafted and that visas were obtained for everyone on that list before I left Jamaica. Sila C.I. However this was handled, critics would surely argue that I had unduly meddled with the process. My only course was to act with a clean hand and a pure heart, observe principles of collective security, and trust in Jah. I had 3 weeks in Jamaica to resolve these issues, after which time it was necessary that I return to Washington. Let me digress here to make a point about how I had decided to deal with the House. In the first week of my trip to Jamaica I made contact with a U.S. consular representative in Kingston who, through prior arrangement with the Smithsonian, was providing special paperwork for the visas under the umbrella of a usual cultural exchange program. There would have been no mission without this paperwork. With the paperwork in hand, I was faced with a decision. Should I control the paperwork as security in case the selection process broke down? If it did, I was at least assured of being able to obtain visas for the 15 individuals who, if need be, I could hand-pick. Or should I turn over the usual paperwork to the de facto chairman of the selection committee, Brother Miguel Lorne? I believed that, for better or for worse, the House had to collectively work through this process by itself. A heavy hand by someone perceived as an outsider would have hopelessly compromised matters. As it turned out, enough heat was generated over my involvement. Although I have some mixed feelings about having turned over the paperwork to Brother Miguel, this was the proper course. The point I wish to make, however, is that my decision more or less enabled him to control how events would unfold from that point forward, especially as to when the delegation would move to the embassy. Brother Miguel remained vague about when a definitive list would be drafted and when the move to the embassy would be made. This created a number of problems for those who were positioning themselves for a place on the mission, especially those elders who had trod in from country. They were being held hostage by the process. If they returned to their yards they might forfeit a place on the delegation. To remain in town they had to hustle and live off their social credit with others. Ultimately, matters came to a head with the brethren and sistren with whom I was dealing with at Church Street. A number of these elders like Pa Ashanti, Bongo Tawny, Bongo Bigger, Sister Ina, and Bongo Shifan had come from country and found it necessary to go there, waiting for Miguel to announce the date for the embassy move. There was considerable grumbling among this group, a number of whom I was forced to support out of my own pocket while we waited. I was of the opinion that Miguel was seeking to wait me out. Once the date for my return to DC passed, he could assume control of the process himself. I resolved that this would not be the case. Deep prophetic signs. An event at Church Street brought things to a head. I was in the final week of my stay and the visa impasse had not been resolved. The resolution of these matters came through the power of the Father himself. One afternoon, while seated in a reasoning at Church Street, an earthquake, which registered, prophetically, 5.5 on the Richter scale, struck Kingston. The memory is still vivid in my mind. At first there was a low rumbling rising in tempo, which my mind sought to process. One initially registered it as a train pulling into a station. And then I realized that we were miles from the railway. Cries of Earthquake Bun, and Rastafari made clear the source of the vibrations as the brethren and sistren in the yard began chanting Isis. This was unmistakably a prophetic sign. On this overcast day and dreary day, another confirming sign followed. After the earthquake, myself and a group of about 5 or 6 brethren resolved to march to Brother Miguel's law office to insist that the embassy move take place immediately. As the decision was collectively ratified, a single beam of sunlight about 3 feet in diameter broke through the overcast sky and enveloped our small group. I recall looking at Bongo Bigger and Bongo Tawny at that moment and seeing their locks transformed into electric antennae by the late afternoon rays of light. This was the seal. Off we marched to Ras Miguel offices at 133 Tower Street. When we arrived, Brother Miguel was out of the office. He later said that I had cursed and insulted his secretary, a charge which led to a public row between Miguel and myself before an assembly of brethren and sistren in his law offices the following year. In any event, this precipitated a move to the embassy 2 days later. When arrived there was yet another fortuitous sign. The U.S. consular agent assigned to our group had a friendly nature and an appropriate name, Mr. Daniel Roots. *A similar sign, taken to confirm the blessing of His Majesty, would be apparent at the delegation's first venue at Howard University in Washington, D.C. when the delegation made their presentation at the Blackburn Center. Arrangements had already been put in place through the Smithsonian Office of International Affairs to provide paperwork for 15 elders. Despite this official limit, an additional 16 individuals traveled en masse to the U.S. Embassy on the day when visas were to be obtained. 26 persons eventually received visas to enter the United States. 2 delegations actually traveled. A large group embarked for New York, which included a group of 15 officially covered by Smithsonian paperwork, along with other individuals like Mutabaruka, Ras Ayar V, and 1 or 2 others. A smaller group, which included Pa Ashanti, Ras Historian, Ras Rose, and a few others, traveled to Los Angeles. I left Jamaica satisfied that Selassie had guided my movements. These T-rods were both divine missions and historic events which were conducted under strict Nyabingi protocol. Of the 15 elders nominated by the House, only 2, Ras Sam Brown and Bongo Watto, had ever traveled abroad to North America. Both were historic figures within the movement with somewhat different orientations to Rastafari liberty. Ras Sam was the first Rasta to for a seat in the Jamaican Parliament, a highly controversial move given the traditional political stance of the Rastafari. Many respect his intellectual abilities and outspoken views. Bongo Watto is a ubiquitous presence at Nyabingi, a patriarch respected for his oratory and ritual abilities as a priest within the churchical order of the house. He is known for his disciplined and uncompromising position on issues of liberty. Even though Bongo Watto had gone with the group to the embassy and secured a visa, he chose, for whatever reason, not to travel with the delegation. As a result, Ras Sam Brown came to serve as the ranking elder and principal spokesman for the mission during its official presentations abroad. Other notable events. There were a number of significant events in my movements with elders who eventually departed on the 1988 mission, which should be more publicly known within the House. The first of these involved a day-long reasoning between several elders, Bongo Time, Bongo Shi Fan, Tawny, Bigger, and Sister Ina, and a group of Howlites at Salt River, Hill 60. I had been made aware of this group by Sister Farika Birhan, who along with Ras E.P. McPherson had visited them around 1982. On the eve of the first Nyabingi mission to the United States, this was an historic meeting between the custodians of two different roots traditions within Rastafari, those from the Divine Order of the Nyabingi and the remnants of Leonard Howell's Ethiopian Salvation Society who were resident at Pinnacle. For their part, these remnants of Howell's commune at Pinnacle, Mother White, Brother Rupert White and Sister Audrey, were keen to learn about the house's imminent trod abroad and to be remembered as a foundational point of Rastafari culture and resistance. During an all-day session of reasoning, the historic role of the Nyabingi house was confirmed by Brother Rupert and Sister Audrey, who stated that Howell had once told his followers that they had better sit firm in their seats because there would be a set of people, dreadlocks, coming after them to take their seat. The day was filled with upful reasoning and an unprecedented mix of both Bingi chants from the elders and Kumina Balo and Ethiopian Salvation Society chants from the Howlites. The traces of an historic circle had been joined and strengthened on that day. During that visit I tape recorded the reasonings of the Howlites and elders as well as most of the chanting. Approximately 2 years ago I made those audio tapes available to Ras E.P. McPherson. His plan at the time was to use the tapes along with tapes he had recorded during an earlier visit to the Howlites to produce a musical CD under the title of Kalunga. That CD is now complete. To my knowledge, it was done exclusively at his personal expense and under his authorship. This CD now provides contemporary Rastafari with a rarely glimpsed side of the earliest roots tradition of Rastafari. These happenings were all a prelude to the first official trod of the house to the United States. The following year, .1 would also be involved in another trod which brought some of the same elders to the Smithsonian to participate in the Festival of American Folklife. See below. Both of these trods traveled under the banner of the Rainbow Circle Throne Room of Jah Rastafari. Described below are a number of the significant events associated with each of these missions. Washington, D.C. connection and subsequent missions abroad. A. The first Rainbow Circle Throne Room Trod. The first trod was received in New York at the Universal Rastafari Movement Center in Harlem, where it was received by, among others, Prince Dawit, and the president of the Brooklyn chapter of the UNA. Videotape documentation was made of this historic reception and is currently at the Smithsonian. The first venue at which the elders presented in Washington, D.C. was in the Blackburn Center at Howard University. 3. For the record, let it be that a group of non-dreadlocks Rastafari brethren representing the mystic revelation of Rastafari traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1977 and performed at Howard University. Alvaranga was part of this group. Raz was the only dreadlocks Rasta who traveled as part of this troupe. This was entirely fitting for a number of reasons. Howard University is a predominantly black institution. His Imperial Majesty sent Malaku Bayan to Howard for education prior to charging him with organizing and establishing the Ethiopian World Federation. Professor Abi Ford teaches at Howard. Professor Ford is the son of Mignon Ford, the musical director for Marcus Garvey's UNIA. It was the senior Ford who authored the anthem, the Ethiopian national anthem, which is sung today at Nyabingi celebrations. Finally, Emperor Selassie personally visited Howard at the same time that he attended John F. Kennedy's funeral in Washington, D.C. He deposited, at that time, several religious icons and Ethiopian artifacts which became part of the Moreland Spingarn collection curated by Professor Thomas C. Battle. Dr. Battle hosted the elders during their program at Howard University, see Appendix 4. 2. A number of other venues followed. These included Johns Hopkins University, Southeastern University, the International Center of the Smithsonian Institution, and African Liberation Day again on the Howard University campus. Videotape documentation of all of these events are presently in the collection of the Human Studies Film Archives, Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian Folklife program also audiotaped all of the elders' presentation at the International Center and holds tapes of these. In addition, Nick Spitzer, an Anther Folklife associate, traveled with me to Baltimore during the first week of the elders' arrival. There was some brief interviewing was done. It was originally hoped that this taping would provide the basis for a program on Radio Smithsonian promoting the elders' tour in the eastern United States. Ironically, this was sabotaged by a number of the elders and some of the DC community activists with whom I attempted to coordinate. In retrospect, it is clear that an elders program of this size, especially one done with the involvement of any outside organization, will be fraught with problems. Of these problems derive from the inability of the group to reach agreement-specific agendas. In some cases, as in this example, the group becomes its own worst enemy. 3. The second trod came in July of 1989 when and was arranged through the Office of Folklife Programs, Smithsonian Institution. I have heard sound drop that the Smithsonian Institution arranged for and paid for this trod. And it is even generally assumed by some of those on the mission that the Smithsonian called for the elders again because they wished them to perform at the Folklife Festival. Let me set the record straight. B. The second Rainbow Circle Throne Room Trod. In 1989 the Office of Folklife had planned a Caribbean venue for the festival at which they wished to showcase several African, Caribbean traditions. To this end, they sent representatives to Cuba to arrange for Santeria and Palo Monte groups representing Yoruba and Congo culture, respectively. They also made arrangements to bring a Vodun troupe from Haiti and performers from Puerto Rico and Jamaica as well. In the Jamaican case, they had already established a working relationship with Olive Lewin who, it was assumed, would arrange for a Maroon, Kumina, Echu groups to travel to DC. Through negotiations with Miss Lewin, however, it became clear that she was not interested in assisting a Rastafari delegation to travel abroad. At this point, the Folklife program was prepared to proceed without a Rasta presence at the festival. I had my own working relationship with colleagues at Folklife and I argued that it was impossible to mount a credible program on African, Caribbean culture without a Rastafari presence. A number of my Folklife colleagues agreed and, after some negotiations, I spent a month in Jamaica, part of which time was spent organizing a second delegation. During this time I generated some videotape of chanting and drumming shot in Bongo Shepan's yard as well as some videotape of Pa Ashanti in Sister Ina's yard. The latter tape was shot 2 days before Pa unexpectedly passed away. There was, however, a key problem with the format of the Folklife Festival which I felt was not appropriate for an elders mission. This was not so much the format of the festival itself as the logistics of how festival participants were restricted in their movements once they arrived in Washington, D.C. That is, it is customary for participants to be housed collectively in a nearby hotel more or less under the supervision of designated handlers. This type of restriction was unworkable and not befitting the dignity of the elders as international ambassadors. The primary purpose of the trod was not simply to make a series of formal presentations at the festival, something which I felt would further build upon the positive profile of Rastafari established the year before, but to connect and network with the adjacent communities of Rastafari in DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and beyond. As a trade-off for being unencumbered and for being granted visas which extended beyond the period of the festival itself, something that was not done for other participants, it was necessary for myself and the local Rastafari community to raise funds to cover travel and lodging. Most of the funds were covered by a single individual, Ras Maurice Clark. I covered the cost of 2 tickets. Lodging, as in the previous year, was supported by brethren and sistren in the community. For over the years I taped a number of Pa Ashanti's reasonings and reflections on the history of the house. I used these materials shortly after his passing to write an entitled The Half That's Never Been Told Pa Ashanti and the Development of Nyabingi Music. This piece was never formally published but simply distributed it by hand to various Rastafari in DC, New York, the UK, and Jamaica. Among it was sent to Ras Kasate of the Shilling for Nyabingi Project, I Chappenham Muse, London. High points. There was a notable event which occurred on the final day of the festival when the paramount king of Ghana's Ga peoples paid an impromptu visit to the festival and toured the Caribbean venue with his full entourage. Only 2 of the festival organizers were aware of the visit, and one of these had made special arrangements with Colonel Harris, the leader of Jamaica's Moortown Maroons, to receive the Gar King in the Jamaican dancing boat at the end of his tour through the compound. It was generally thought that this would provide an historic moment both for the King's entourage and the Maroons insofar as the latter trace much of their Chromanti culture to Ghana and the Ashanti heritage. As Jarwood of it, this event never took place. When the Gar King finished his tour, Colonel Harris was elsewhere at the time. Settling themselves under a large elm tree, the King and his retinue found themselves face to face with the Nyabingi delegation, which, ironically, had been forced to cough under the tree for most of the festival. Let me point out that unlike all the other group invited to the festival, the Rastas were not given a special resting place. Rather, they found themselves symbolically marginalized in the festival space among other Jamaicans and Caribbean participants. Once again prophecy ruled, the stone that the builder refused became the head cornerstone. In an impromptu ceremony, the King greeted each of the brethren and sistren in turn. The elders then took up their drums and escorted the King and his group into the boat and began to chant Bingi in his honor. They opened with the chant "Closer Than a Brother." In turn, the elders were honored by a blessing from the King's high priest. All of this is documented on video now in the HSFA collections. I will simply list, in order, the other high points of this trod. Following the Folklife Festival, the elders trod to New York, where they were featured in the African Street Festival Inn. Later that month, the remaining core group of elders opened the Washington, D.C. Reggae Fest with a session of Nyabingi chanting and oratory. They were also featured in a full-length article in the city paper, Washington's alternative newspaper, Appendix 6. In July, the group traveled to Chicago to participate in an event celebrating the King's birthday, July 23. They became the first Nyabingi presence in Chicago and appeared on several radio programs. This event was organized by Sister Kate. In the aftermath of these events, a number of elders remained. In the United States, this included Bongo Shifan, Pido, and Marcus, along with Ras Maurice Clark, who had remained there from the previous trod. These individuals came to form the core of the Washington and Baltimore Rasta communities. Ultimately, Ras Marcus went on to organize a series of annual African Family Day celebrations in Baltimore and to become something of a community activist. Through his organization, Ancestors Roots, Bongo Shifan, who had also remained in Baltimore for a time, relocated to Atlanta, Georgia, where he became the focus of that community. Events in 1990 and 1991. The missions of 1988 and 1989 were successful enough to the point that they convinced at least one other conservative institution, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, that a similar Rastafari program should be mounted on their part. Because people there knew of my involvement with the Rainbow Circle Throne Room, I was contacted by the director of their Department of Education to see if I would be interested in assisting them to organize a Nyabingi program in May of 1990. See Appendix 7. I agreed to this. On the museum side, I worked with Ishmael Calderon and Evangeline Kim, who networked with the New York community. On the Rasta side, I worked with Ras Maurice Clark, Bongo Shifan, and Pa Jack Hewitt, a former member of Ras Michael and the Sons of Negus, to organize this program. We also made arrangements for Ras Michael to travel from Jamaica to participate in the event. About 2 weeks prior to the event, Bongo Tawny and Bongo Bigger traveled on their own initiative from Jamaica to participate. Ras Michael, of the Sons of Negus, joined the program in New York and participated in the event as well. This became the first Rastafari program to be funded by a New York State Council on the Arts. The program was entitled Rastafari, Beats of the Heart, Rhythms of Resistance, See Attachment. Prior to the event, the elders were approached by Ras Stafford Ashanti, the host of a New York-based television program called Reggae Strong. Stafford requested and received permission from them to videotape the event for the stated purpose of airing some of the tape on his program. It was agreed, however, that he would provide the elders with a full copy of the videotapes which he shot at the event. To my knowledge, none of this material was ever aired on television. Nor did the elders or the American Museum of Natural History ever receive copies of the tapes shot by Stafford, see Appendix 8. In August of 1990, the elders made a presentation at the Organization of American States, OAS, in Washington, D.C. where they met with several ambassadors, chanted bingi, and presented poetry and oratory. I videotaped various parts of the program, including scenes of the elders backstage in the meeting chamber of the OAS. This tape is currently in the Human Studies Film Archives, Smithsonian. Subsequently, 7 of the elders, Bongo Shifan, Tawny, Bigger, Marcus, Pido, Raz Headful, and Sister Bubbles, associated themselves with an American-born Rasta sistrin, Sister Malika Sojourner Alcindor, to produce a record of Nyabingi chants and oratory. This was produced jointly by Sister Malika and Dr. Dredd, Gary Himmelfarb, the owner of RAS Records in Washington, D.C., and released under the title, Rastafari Elders. For the record, I have included the front ice piece and liner notes as part of this document. I wish to make clear that I took no part in this production and that it was initiated completely by the elders and Sister Malika. Bongo Pido, who remains in Washington, D.C., went on to produce another tape CD with RAS Records entitled Modern Antique. Raz Headful relocated to Atlanta where he is currently resident. Finally, I note one event held in 1991 in which I was associated. This was entitled The Lion and the Lamb. It was an evening presentation of Rastafari philosophy, chanting, and oratory sponsored by the Anacostia Museum of the Smithsonian Institution. It featured a presentation by Raz Sam Brown and involved most of the elders from the D.C. community, including Raz Abraham, Raz Maurice Clark, and Pa Jack as well as Raz Ibo Wright, who just happened to be passing through D.C. at the time. The entirety of this event was videotaped by the Anacostia Museum. A copy of the program is on deposit in the Hurton Studies Film Archives, Smithsonian, see Appendix 9. This program was part of a prelude to an exhibit entitled The Black Mosaic, which sought to generate public understanding about the diversity of African cultures in the D.C. area. This exhibit had a Rasta presence as well. All of these public programming initiatives have gone a long way toward raising the profile of Rastafari in the New York, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Philadelphia communities as well as elsewhere in North America. They have also helped to consolidate Rastafari communities in these locations by providing them with a small core of elders around whom the community can network and organize. In all of these sites, Nyabingi ceremonies have become a part of the annual calendar of Rasta life. I have included copies of various flyers disseminated mostly by the Washington, D.C. community announcing these celebrations, see Appendix. Concluding remark. Let me offer a few concluding to the House based on some of the arguments have heard since 1988. First, I wish to make clear that I became involved in these initiatives for only one reason: to assist the elders to disseminate the truth about Rastafari and to help dispel the misinformation which continues to circulate about INL culture and traditions. I am confident that righteousness exalts a nation whatever color they may be, whatever creed they may profess. This is part of the Father's work. Second, in offering myself to the House in this regard, I have never held financial considerations in mind. The truth cannot be sold. This is one of the primary reasons why I have consistently refused to become involved in any kind of commercial endeavor with the House or with individual brethren or sisterin. I have no problem assisting individuals to help themselves economically. I am not and will not, however, be an agent for the House or for any individuals. I draw attention to these points because of the kind of sounds that I hear drop from time to time. Namely, that I have become big off of Rasta. That I have made millions for either myself or the Smithsonian. This is not only nonsense, and the House, as a whole, needs to get in touch with reality with respect to these kinds of things. These kinds of fantasies are counterproductive for the House, especially at a time when it is seeking to become a bona fide international organization. By my own estimation, my involvement in these international trods has cost me several thousands of dollars out of my own pocket, as well as the volunteering of my personal time and skills. When I returned to Yard in 1989, the year after the first trod, I was confronted by some brethren who claimed that each participant in the trod was supposed to have made $77,000 US. Similar nonsense was broadcast about those who participated in the Folklife Festival. Only a fool leans on this type of misunderstanding. Rastafari in Yard need to understand that it is only the generosity of Rastafari brethren and sistren abroad which have made some of these trods possible. Most have gone into their own pockets to assist the elders to travel. Similarly, many went into their own pockets to give them money with which they could return to Jamaica. Regardless of what people may think, money does not grow on trees in America. One has to earn it. Those in Yard need to appreciate this fact. Those in Yard also need to understand that Rastafari communities abroad have many of the same internal divisions as does the house in Yard. This is a reality that needs to be kept in mind as the Nyabingi house moves forward in the international process. I have heard it said by one elder that the house is basically on training wheels when it comes to its ambassadorial qualifications. This is to say, that it needs to become more collective with respect to dealing with people like myself or with community organizers abroad who may have their own agendas in promoting the house or the movement in general. In closing, the house should be aware that in March 1995, during the course of videotaping the Earth-Strong Nyabingi of Ras Airlights in Cypress Hall, I reasoned with the assembled elders, brethren, and sistren about this report. Those present included Bongo Time, Ras Wakai, Bongo Shifan, Bongo Lloyd, Airlights, Bongo Tawny, Ras Sojai, Ras Lulu, Sister Ina, Sister Daphne, Ras Witterdred, and several other elders with whom I am familiar only through their countenance. At that time I left a preliminary compilation of documents associated with the 1988 to 1989 trods in the hands of Ras Witterdred in his capacity as an elect of records. I promised at that time to go forward to my gates, prepare a more in-depth report, which I now have in hand, and forward this report to the House at Scots Pass, Manchester in care of the Supreme Council. Subsequently, the full report was issued to Bongo Time, Ras Ivy, and Ras Wakai. The report has similarly been available to the Washington, D.C. community and will be made so to other court community that may request it. From such time unto this time. One Heart. Jakes Homiak. 5812 La Vista Drive. Alexandria, Virginia 22310 Director. National Anthropological Archives, National Museum of Natural History, 10th Street and Constitution Avenue. Smithsonian Institution. Washington, 20560 Tex, 30123866655.